The cruel midday sun beat down on Fiona Evans as she stood trembling on the makeshift auction block, clutching her 3-month-old daughter tightly to her chest. Whispers rippled through the crowd gathered in the dusty main street of Kearney, Nebraska, a frontier town that had sprung up along the Oregon Trail in the 1850s. It was the summer of 1872, and Fiona's world had collapsed into this singular moment of humiliation. "1 sack of grain," called out the man gripping her arm, her husband's brother, Walter, who had taken control of everything after James died of typhoid fever just 6 weeks ago. "That's all I'm asking for this woman and her brat. 1 sack of decent grain to get me through winter." Fiona's tears had dried hours ago, leaving salt tracks on her dirt-smudged face. Her auburn hair hung limply from beneath a tattered bonnet, and her once fine dress was now threadbare and stained. The baby, little Hannah, slept against her chest, blissfully unaware of their desperate circumstances. "This ain't right, Walter," someone called from the crowd. "You can't sell a woman like she's cattle. She's my brother's widow, and the law says what was his is mine now," Walter shot back, his voice slurring from the whiskey he'd been drinking since dawn. "I ain't feeding 2 extra mouths when I can barely feed myself. 1 sack of grain. Who'll take her?" Fiona kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. She'd been born to a respectable family back east, but had followed James west with dreams of building a life together. Now, at 22, she was being bartered away like property, with no money, no family, and nowhere to turn. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and Fiona sensed someone new approaching. Heavy boot steps stopped before the auction block, and a deep voice cut through the murmurs. "This isn't legal, and you know it." Fiona's gaze dropped to the stranger who had spoken. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt. A cowboy hat shaded his face, but she could see a strong jawline darkened by several days' growth of beard. His eyes, piercing blue, locked with hers for a moment before turning back to Walter. "Mind your business, stranger," Walter spat. "This here's a family matter." "I'm making it my business," the cowboy replied evenly. "Thomas Irwin's the name. I own the Triple T Ranch south of here." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a burlap sack. "Here's your grain and more besides. I've got 3 sacks of good Nebraska wheat and $20 in cash." Walter's eyes widened at the offer, far more generous than he'd expected. "Well now, that's more like it." Fiona's heart hammered in her chest. Being bought by a stranger, what fate awaited her and Hannah at this man's ranch? Would she be forced into marriage? Or worse? Thomas Irwin stepped closer, his voice pitched low so only Walter and Fiona could hear. "I'm buying her freedom, not her person. Once this transaction is done, she's beholden to no one. Understand?" Walter shrugged. "Don't care what you do with her once you've paid. She's more trouble than she's worth anyway." Thomas handed over the grain and money, then extended his hand to help Fiona down from the platform. His touch was gentle but firm as he guided her away from Walter and through the dispersing crowd. "Thank you," Fiona whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of silent crying. "But why would you do this for a stranger?" Thomas led her toward a hitching post where a magnificent chestnut stallion waited. No decent man could stand by and watch what was happening. "Do you have any belongings?" "Just what I'm carrying," Fiona admitted, adjusting Hannah in her arms. "Walter sold everything else." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've got a place you can stay in town for a few days while you figure out what you want to do next. The widow Parker runs a boarding house. She's a good woman who won't ask too many questions." Fiona blinked in surprise. "You're not. You don't expect me to." Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes, and he shook his head firmly. "No, madam. Like I said, I bought your freedom, not you. You don't owe me anything, least of all." He cleared his throat awkwardly. I just couldn't stand by and watch. For the first time in weeks, Fiona felt something other than despair. This stranger had given her a chance to breathe, to think, to determine her own fate. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness," she said. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "No need. Now, let's get you and your little one somewhere safe." As they walked down Kearney's Main Street, Fiona holding her baby close and Thomas leading his horse, several townsfolk nodded respectfully to the rancher. Fiona noticed the deference in their expressions, the way conversations paused as they passed. Thomas Irwin was clearly a man of some standing in this community. Mrs. Parker's boarding house stood at the quieter end of town, a well-maintained two-story structure with flower boxes in the windows and a freshly swept porch. Thomas knocked on the door, and moments later it swung open to reveal a plump, silver-haired woman with kind eyes. "Thomas Irwin. What brings you to town on a Tuesday?" she exclaimed, then noticed Fiona and the baby. Her expression softened immediately. "And who might these folks be, Mrs. Parker?" "This is Mrs. Fiona Evans and her daughter. They need a place to stay for a spell. I'd be obliged if you could make room for them." The older woman didn't hesitate. "Of course. Come in, dear, you look dead on your feet." She ushered Fiona inside, then turned back to Thomas. "Will you be joining us for supper?" Thomas removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair with streaks of gold from the sun. "Much as I'd like to, I need to head back to the ranch. My foreman Jenkins can only handle things for so long before the men start getting restless." Mrs. Parker nodded understandingly. "Well, don't be a stranger. I'll take good care of your friends." Before Thomas could leave, Fiona found her voice again. "Mr. Irwin, I don't know what I'm going to do after a few days. I have no money, no skills beyond keeping house." Thomas considered her words. Mrs. Parker might know of work in town. "And if nothing turns up, well, my sister's been looking for help at the ranch. She runs the household while I manage the cattle operation." "You do that?" Fiona asked, disbelieving. "After already doing so much." "Let's just see how things unfold," Thomas replied. "Rest now. We can talk more when I come back to town at the end of the week." After Thomas departed, Mrs. Parker showed Fiona to a small but clean room on the second floor. It had a bed, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. "This should do for you and your little angel," the older woman said. "Supper's at 6, but I can bring you up a tray if you're too tired to come down." "Thank you, but I think I'd like the company," Fiona replied, gently placing the still sleeping Hannah on the bed and surrounding her with pillows to prevent her from rolling off. Once alone, Fiona sat in the rocking chair and finally allowed herself to truly breathe. The events of the day seemed surreal: the public humiliation of being sold, the unexpected rescue, and now this clean, safe room. She thought of Thomas Irwin, a man who'd spent good money and valuable grain to help a woman he'd never met before. In her experience, men rarely did anything without expecting something in return, yet he seemed genuinely to want nothing from her. As the days passed, Fiona settled into a routine at Mrs. Parker's. Hannah proved to be a favorite among the other boarders: a retired schoolteacher, a young bank clerk, and 2 sisters who worked at the dressmaker's shop. Mrs. Parker herself doted on the baby, often insisting on holding her so Fiona could have proper meals or take a bath. "That child's an angel," Mrs. Parker declared on the 3rd evening as they sat in the parlor. "Takes after her mama, I'd say." Fiona smiled sadly. "She has her father's eyes. Sometimes when she looks at me, it's like James is still here." "You must miss him terribly," the older woman said gently. "I do," Fiona admitted. "We were only married 2 years. He was a good man, nothing like his brother." Walter was always jealous of James, always felt he got the short end of everything. When James died, she swallowed hard. Walter made it clear I was just another burden he'd inherited. Mrs. Parker's face darkened. What Walter did was shameful, selling a woman and child like property. If Thomas hadn't stepped in. She shook her head. You know, that young man's one of the finest souls in these parts. Built that ranch up from nothing after coming west 10 years ago. His sister joined him a few years back after losing her husband in the war. He mentioned I might find work there, Fiona said hesitantly. You could do worse, Mrs. Parker replied. The Irwin place is prosperous and Thomas treats his workers fair. His sister Flora's a bit reserved, but she's decent enough. On Friday morning, Fiona was helping Mrs. Parker hang laundry in the yard when Thomas's chestnut stallion appeared at the gate. The rancher looked even more imposing in daylight, his tall frame straight in the saddle, his face partly shadowed by his hat. He dismounted with easy grace and tied his horse to the fence post. "Good morning, ladies," he called, removing his hat as he approached. "How are you settling in, Mrs. Evans?" "Very well, thanks to Mrs. Parker's kindness," Fiona replied. She noticed his eyes flicker to Hannah, who was sleeping in a basket in the shade of a large elm tree. "And the little one?" "She's thriving," Fiona said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "Would you like to come inside for some coffee? It's the least I can offer after everything you've done." Thomas accepted, and soon they were seated at Mrs. Parker's kitchen table. The older woman busied herself at the stove, deliberately giving them some privacy while remaining present as propriety demanded. "I've been asking around town about work for you," Thomas said, warming his hands around the coffee cup. "The general store needs help, but it's only 2 days a week. The hotel's fully staffed, and the school won't need an assistant until fall." Fiona nodded, having expected as much. Mrs. Parker mentioned something similar. "I'm willing to take whatever's available, even if it means piecing together several positions." Thomas hesitated before continuing. "My offer still stands. My sister could use help with the household, and there'd be a proper wage along with room and board for you and your daughter." "That's very generous," Fiona said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose. It's no imposition. The ranch is growing, and Flora can't manage everything herself anymore. We've got 6 hands now, plus Jenkins, our foreman, and my sister's been complaining for months about all the cooking and cleaning." Mrs. Parker turned from the stove. "It's a good opportunity, Fiona. The Triple T is one of the most respected spreads in the county." Fiona considered her options. She had barely $1 to her name and no prospects beyond the generosity of strangers. Her baby deserved security, a roof over her head, proper food. And something about Thomas Irwin inspired the steadiness in his blue eyes, the straightforward way he spoke. "When would you need me to start?" she asked finally. Relief crossed Thomas's face. "Whenever you're ready. I can come back with the wagon tomorrow if that suits." They agreed on the arrangements. Fiona would assist Flora with running the household in exchange for a small wage plus lodging for herself and Hannah. She would have Sundays off and could visit town when Thomas or one of the hands made the trip in for supplies. After Thomas left, promising to return the next morning, Mrs. Parker gave Fiona a knowing look. "That man didn't just happen to be in town the day Walter tried to sell you. He was delivering cattle to the railway and overheard talk in the saloon about what was planned. Rode straight to the auction without even stopping to water his horse." Fiona's eyes widened. "He deliberately came to help me, but he made it seem like he was just passing by." "Thomas Irwin isn't one to boast about doing the right thing," Mrs. Parker replied. "Judge a man by his actions, not his words, my dear." That night, as Fiona packed her few belongings and prepared for the next chapter of her life, She found herself thinking about the quiet rancher who had changed her fate with a simple act of decency. She wasn't naive enough to believe that the road ahead would be easy, but for the first time since James's death, she felt a flicker of hope for her future and for Hannah's. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Fiona dressed in her best, which wasn't saying much, just a faded blue calico dress that had seen better days, and prepared Hannah for the journey. Mrs. Parker had given her a small bundle of supplies. Some baby clothes another boarder had left behind, a jar of honey from her own bees, and a loaf of freshly baked bread. "A homecoming gift," the older woman explained, pressing the items into Fiona's hands. "And you remember what I said, if things don't work out at the ranch for any reason, my door is always open to you and this little angel." Thomas arrived promptly at 9 with a wagon instead of his horse. It was well maintained, with a canvas cover to shield passengers from the sun. He had brought along a wooden crate lined with blankets. "Thought it might make a better traveling bed for the little one," he explained somewhat sheepishly. "My sister helped fix it up." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Fiona deeply. "It's perfect, thank you." After heartfelt goodbyes to Mrs. Parker, they set off, heading south out of Kearney. The morning was pleasant, with a gentle breeze taking the edge off the summer heat. Thomas proved to be a considerate traveling companion, stopping whenever Hannah fussed, so Fiona could tend to her needs. "How far is the ranch?" Fiona asked as they passed the last scattered buildings that marked the town's edge. "About 12 miles, Thomas replied. "Should take us 3 hours or so at this pace. The land changes as we go, gets more rolling with good water access from Cedar Creek. That's what made me choose it when I first came out here." "How long have you been in Nebraska?" Thomas adjusted his hat against the sun. "Going on 10 years now. Came west from Pennsylvania after the war with not much more than the horse I was riding and the clothes on my back. Worked as a hand on different ranches until I'd saved enough to buy my first piece of land. Started with 50 acres and 20 head of cattle." Pride crept into his voice. "Now the Triple T runs to nearly 1,000 acres and 300 head. "That's quite an accomplishment," Fiona said sincerely. Thomas shrugged modestly. "Been fortunate. And I've had good men working with me. Jenkins, my foreman, has been there almost from the beginning. The other hands are reliable too." As they traveled, the landscape gradually changed from the flat prairie around Kearney to more varied terrain with gentle hills and occasional stands of cottonwood trees marking watercourses. After about 2 hours, Thomas pointed ahead to where a line of trees indicated a more substantial creek. "That's our boundary line coming up. Once we cross Cedar Creek, we're on Triple T land." The creek was running clear and strong, and the wagon splashed through at a shallow crossing point. Beyond it, the grassland seemed richer, dotted with wildflowers and supporting healthy-looking cattle that raised their heads curiously as the wagon passed. "The ranch house is just beyond that rise," Thomas said, gesturing to a gentle hill ahead. "My father was a builder back east, so I made sure to learn enough from him to put up something solid." As they crested the hill, the Triple T spread out before them. The main house was larger than Fiona had expected, a handsome 2-story structure built of sturdy logs with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Nearby stood a large barn, bunkhouse, smokehouse, and several corrals. A vegetable garden was visible to one side, and chickens scratched in a fenced yard. Everything was neat and well maintained, speaking to the prosperity Thomas had mentioned. A woman emerged onto the porch as they approached, tall and straight-backed, with her brown hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a practical dress of brown cotton and a white apron. This must be Flora, Fiona thought, noting the family resemblance in her features. Thomas drew the wagon to a halt before the house and helped Fiona down. Hannah had awakened and was looking around with wide, curious eyes. "Flora, this is Mrs. Fiona Evans and her daughter Hannah," Thomas said as his sister approached. "Mrs. Evans, my sister Flora Irwin." Flora's expression was reserved but not unfriendly as she nodded in greeting. "Welcome to Triple T, Mrs. Evans. My brother has told me about your situation. I'm sorry for your troubles. Thank you for opening your home to us," Fiona replied. "I promise I'll earn my keep." "I've no doubt of that," Flora said with the hint of a smile. "Anyone raising a child alone knows about hard work. Come inside and I'll show you where you'll be staying." The interior of the house was as impressive as its exterior, clean, spacious, and comfortably furnished. The main floor contained a large kitchen with a massive cook stove, a dining room with a table big enough for 10, a comfortable parlor, and Thomas's study. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms and a small sitting area. "You and the baby will have this room," Flora said, opening a door to reveal a pleasant chamber with a double bed, dresser, washstand, and a small table with 2 chairs near the window. "The view's quite nice in the morning. I'm across the hall and Thomas has the room at the end. The 4th room is for guests, though we don't get many out this way." "It's lovely," Fiona said, genuinely impressed by the accommodation. It was far better than she had expected, and certainly better than the cramped cabin she had shared with James and then endured under Walter's grudging charity. "I'll let you get settled," Flora said. "Dinner will be at noon. The men come in from the morning work then. We serve it in the kitchen. Supper's at 6, more formal in the dining room when Thomas is home." She hesitated, then added, "The baby is welcome at the table, of course. I've found a cradle that Thomas used as an infant. It's in storage but can be brought up if you'd like." "That would be wonderful, thank you." After Flora left, Fiona sat on the bed, Hannah in her lap, and took stock of her new surroundings. The room was clean and airy, with crisp white curtains at the window and a colorful quilt on the bed. Someone, Flora, presumably had placed a small vase of wildflowers on the dresser. "Well, Hannah," she whispered to her daughter, "we seem to have landed on our feet, at least for now." The first few days at the Triple T settled into a rhythm. Fiona learned the household routines, helping Flora with cooking, cleaning, laundry, and tending the vegetable garden and chickens. The work was hard but satisfying, and Flora proved to be efficient and knowledgeable, if somewhat reserved. Thomas was often out from dawn till dusk, managing the ranch operations with Jenkins. The other hands, Bill, Charlie, Mac, Hank, Pete, and young Sam, who couldn't have been more than 18, took their meals at the bunkhouse, except for the midday dinner, when everyone gathered at the large kitchen table. Fiona quickly discovered that these mealtimes were important social occasions. The men were respectful in her presence, watching their language and making efforts to clean up before coming to the table. They doted on Hannah, making silly faces to get her to smile and offering to hold her so Fiona could eat without juggling the baby. "Never seen men so taken with an infant," Flora remarked one afternoon as they kneaded bread dough together. "Even Jenkins was grinning like a fool when she grabbed his finger yesterday." "She has a way of winning people over," Fiona agreed. Even Walter couldn't bring himself to be openly cruel to her, though he resented her existence. Flora's hands stilled on the dough. "What that man did to you was despicable. When Thomas told me," she shook her head. "Well, let's just say I've never seen my brother so angry." "He's been more than kind," Fiona said softly. "I don't know what would have become of us if he hadn't intervened." "Thomas has always had a strong sense of justice," Flora replied. "Even as a boy, he couldn't abide seeing the weak mistreated." She returned to her kneading. "Our father was the same way. Stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. Over the next 2 weeks, Fiona settled more deeply into life at the Triple T. She found herself watching for Thomas when he rode in from the range, noting the straight line of his back in the saddle, the gentle way he handled his horse. He always asked after Hannah, sometimes bringing little gifts, a handkerchief he'd found in town that was just right for a baby, or a wooden rattle one of the hands had carved during evening downtime. One Sunday afternoon, her day off, Fiona was sitting on the porch with Hannah when Thomas rode up from checking a distant pasture. He dismounted, handed the reins to young Sam, who had appeared from the barn, and approached the house. "Beautiful day," he remarked, settling into the chair beside her. He'd removed his hat, and his hair was damp with sweat from the ride. "How are you finding life at the Triple T so far?" "It's been wonderful," Fiona answered honestly. "Flora has been patient with me as I learn the routines, and everyone has been so kind to Hannah." Thomas smiled, watching as Hannah kicked her feet energetically on the blanket Fiona had spread for her. "She's growing fast, seems more alert every day." "She is. Soon she'll be crawling, then walking, and I'll never have a moment's peace," Fiona laughed. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the chirping of birds in the nearby trees. Then Thomas cleared his throat. "I was thinking," he said, "that Hannah might need more things as she grows. Next time I go to town, would you like to come along? We could visit the general store." Fiona felt a flutter of pleasure at the invitation. "I'd like that very much. It would be nice to get some fabric too, if possible. I should make some new clothes for myself." She glanced down at her worn dress. "I'm afraid my wardrobe isn't very extensive." Thomas nodded. "We can arrange that, and perhaps—" he hesitated, "perhaps you might want to visit Mrs. Parker while we're there. I know she'd be pleased to see how well you and Hannah are doing." The thoughtfulness of the suggestion touched Fiona. "You're very kind to think of that." "Not at all," Thomas replied, looking slightly embarrassed by her gratitude. "It's only natural you'd want to maintain friendships in town." The trip to Kearney took place the following Wednesday. Thomas drove the wagon with Fiona beside him holding Hannah. It was the first time she had been alone with him for any length of time since her arrival at the ranch, and she found herself noticing small things about him: the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the careful way he held the reins, the deep timbre of his voice when he pointed out features of the landscape. In town, their first stop was the general store, where Thomas insisted on purchasing not only baby items for Hannah, but also several lengths of fabric for Fiona to make new dresses. When she protested at the expense, he simply said, "Consider it an advance on your wages." They visited Mrs. Parker next, who was delighted to see them and insisted they stay for lunch. As they were eating, she asked casually, "And how are you finding life at the Triple T, Fiona?" "Everything you hoped. It's more than I could have imagined," Fiona replied. "Everyone has been so welcoming and the work is satisfying." Mrs. Parker's eyes twinkled. "And how are you getting along with Thomas here? Not too demanding a boss, I hope?" Fiona felt herself blushing inexplicably. "Mr. Irwin has been nothing but considerate." "Thomas, please," he said quietly. "No need for formality after all this time." Their eyes met briefly, and Fiona felt that same flutter she'd experienced on the porch. "Thomas," she amended, the name feeling intimate on her tongue. Mrs. Parker watched this exchange with knowing eyes but made no comment. On the journey back to the ranch, Hannah fell asleep in Fiona's arms. The road was empty except for their wagon, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the prairie. "Thank you for today," Fiona said. "It meant a lot to get away from the ranch for a while, though I'm surprised to find I already think of it as home." Thomas glanced at her, his expression softening. "I'm glad you feel that way. The place feels different with you and Hannah there." better. The simple admission hung in the air between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Fiona found herself wanting to reach across the space that separated them, to touch his hand where it rested on his knee. Instead, she tightened her hold on Hannah and said nothing, unsure of her own feelings and wary of reading too much into his words. As summer deepened into early autumn, life at the Triple T continued to evolve. Fiona had grown more confident in her role, taking on additional responsibilities as she and Flora developed a comfortable working relationship. The older woman had gradually warmed to both Fiona and Hannah, even offering to watch the baby occasionally so Fiona could have time to herself. Hannah thrived in the ranch environment, growing stronger and more curious every day. She had begun to sit up on her own and was attempting to crawl, much to everyone's delight. Even the most grizzled of the ranch hands would break into smiles when she babbled at them. One evening in late September, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and Flora had retired early with a headache, Fiona found herself alone with Thomas in the parlor. Hannah had been put to bed upstairs, and Fiona was mending one of Thomas's shirts while he reviewed some ledgers from the cattle sales. "The Harvest Festival is coming up in 2 weeks," Thomas said, breaking the comfortable silence. "It's quite an event in Kearney: dancing, food, games. The whole county turns out." "It sounds wonderful," Fiona replied, not looking up from her stitching. "I was wondering if you'd like to attend, with me." Thomas's voice held an uncharacteristic note of uncertainty. "Flora usually comes along, of course, but as a family." Fiona's hand stilled. "As a family," she echoed, finally raising her eyes to meet his. Thomas set aside his ledger and leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Fiona, I know it might seem sudden and perhaps inappropriate given your recent widowhood, but these past months—" He paused, searching for words. "I've come to care for you and for Hannah, very deeply." Fiona's heart beat rapidly in her chest. "Thomas, I'm not asking for anything," he hurried to add. "Just that you consider the possibility that in time we might—" He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I'm not expressing myself well." "You're doing fine," Fiona said softly, setting her mending aside. "And yes, I would be honored to attend the Harvest Festival with you. As for the rest—" She took a deep breath. "I've come to care for you too, but you're right, it is soon after James. I need a little more time." Relief washed over Thomas's face. "Time is something we have plenty of. I just wanted you to know where I stand." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Nothing changed outwardly. Thomas was still respectful, still careful not to presume or press, but there was a new awareness between them, a sense of possibility that colored their interactions. The Harvest Festival arrived on a perfect autumn day, clear skies, golden sunlight, and just enough crispness in the air to make dancing comfortable. Fiona wore a new dress she had made from the fabric Thomas had purchased, a becoming russet color that complemented her auburn hair, which she had arranged more carefully than usual. Flora, recovering from her recent bout of illness, had insisted on staying home with Hannah. "You two go and enjoy yourselves," she had said with an uncharacteristic wink. "Hannah and I will be just fine on our own." The town square had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from trees, tables groaned with food brought by families from across the county, and a platform had been erected for the musicians. People from all walks of life mingled freely: ranchers, farmers, townspeople, even travelers passing through. Thomas stayed close to Fiona's side, introducing her to neighbors and friends. She noticed the speculative glances, the knowing smiles, but found she didn't mind. When the music started, Thomas turned to her with a question in his eyes. "Would you care to dance?" Fiona placed her hand in his outstretched one. "I'd love to." His hand at her waist was warm and steady as he guided her through the steps of a waltz. They moved together with surprising ease, as if they'd been dancing for years rather than for the first time. "You dance very well," Fiona remarked, looking up at him. "My mother insisted I learn," Thomas replied with a smile. "Said no son of hers would stumble around a dance floor like a newborn colt." As the evening progressed, they danced again and again, stopping only to sample the food and to chat with Mrs. Parker, who observed their closeness with obvious approval. "You two make a handsome couple," the older woman said bluntly. "Almost as if you were meant to find each other, though the circumstances were unfortunate." When they finally headed back to the ranch, the night was well advanced, stars blazing in the clear sky above. The wagon moved slowly along the moonlit road, and Fiona found herself leaning slightly against Thomas's solid presence beside her. "I had a wonderful time," she said. "Thank you for suggesting it." "It was my pleasure," Thomas replied, his voice low in the darkness. "Seeing you smile and laugh. It means more to me than I can say." Fiona turned to look at him, his profile strong and clear in the moonlight. On impulse, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. "Thomas." He drew the wagon to a halt and turned to face her fully. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the night quiet around them except for the occasional snort from the horses and the distant call of a night bird. "May I kiss you, Fiona?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. In answer, she leaned toward him. Their lips met in a gentle, questioning touch that quickly deepened as Thomas raised a hand to cradle her face. When they finally drew apart, Fiona felt breathless, her heart racing. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time," Thomas admitted, his thumb gently tracing her cheekbone. "So have I," Fiona confessed. "I just wasn't sure if it was right with everything that's happened." Thomas took both her hands in his. "I know you still honor James's memory, and I respect that, but I want you to know that what I feel for you is real and lasting. When you're ready, truly ready, I hope you'll consider a future with me." The sincerity in his voice moved Fiona deeply. "I already am," she said softly. "Considering it, I mean. You've given Hannah and me so much, not just shelter and security, but dignity and respect when we needed it most. How could I not come to care for you?" They shared one more kiss before continuing home, this one fuller of promise and shared understanding. The following weeks brought a gradual shift in their relationship. Nothing was announced or formalized, but the household adjusted to the changing dynamic between them. Flora, far from being resentful of Fiona's new place in her brother's affections, seemed genuinely pleased. "He's been alone too long," she confided to Fiona one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. "After losing Sarah during the war, I wasn't sure he'd ever open his heart again." "Sarah?" Fiona asked, surprised. Thomas had never mentioned anyone from his past. Flora nodded. "They were engaged before he went off to fight. She died of typhoid while he was away. It's part of why he came west afterward, too many memories back in Pennsylvania." The revelation gave Fiona a deeper understanding of Thomas's compassion toward her own loss. He knew firsthand the pain of losing someone you loved, the difficulty of rebuilding a life afterward. As October yielded to November, the work on the ranch intensified in preparation for winter. The last hay was cut and stored, repairs were made to buildings, and extra firewood was chopped and stacked. Through it all, Thomas and Fiona found moments to be together, quiet conversations by the fire after Flora had gone to bed, walks along Cedar Creek on Sunday afternoons with Hannah bundled warmly between them, shared glances across the dinner table that spoke volumes. One crisp November morning, Thomas asked Fiona to ride with him to check on a new calf that had been born the previous day. They rode double on his chestnut stallion, Fiona seated in front of him with his arms around her to hold the reins, Hannah securely wrapped and carried in a sling across Fiona's chest. The calf and its mother were doing well, grazing peacefully in a sheltered meadow near the creek. After ensuring all was well, Thomas suggested they dismount for a while to enjoy the unseasonably warm day. They sat on a fallen log beside the creek, Hannah now awake and alert in Fiona's lap. Thomas seemed unusually quiet, almost nervous, as he watched the water flowing past. "Is everything all right?" Fiona asked eventually. "You seem preoccupied." Thomas turned to face her, his expression serious. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about the future, our future if you're willing." Fiona's breath caught in her throat. "Thomas." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This was my mother's," he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. "I've been carrying it with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment." His blue eyes searched hers. "I know it hasn't been very long, and if you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Fiona. I love Hannah too, as if she were my own. I want us to be a family officially, permanently." Tears welled in Fiona's eyes as Thomas continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "I promise to cherish you both, to protect you, to make sure you never again know the kind of desperation that led to that terrible day in Kearney. Will you marry me, Fiona?" The answer came easily, naturally, as if it had been waiting within her heart all along. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas." His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Thomas leaned forward to kiss her, one hand gently cradling Hannah between them. The baby chose that moment to reach up and pat Thomas's cheek with her tiny hand, bringing laughter from both adults. "I think she approves," Fiona said, her voice thick with emotion. "Smart girl," Thomas replied, pressing a kiss to Hannah's forehead. "Just like her mother." They decided on a Christmas wedding, simple and intimate, with just the ranch household and a few close friends from town in attendance. Mrs. Parker insisted on hosting the reception at her boarding house, and the whole town seemed to take an interest in the preparations, many remembering the circumstances of Fiona and Thomas's first meeting. "It's like something from a storybook," Fiona overheard one woman saying in the general store. "The brave rancher rescuing the widow and her baby, then falling in love. Gives you faith in humanity, it does." The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Thomas commissioned a proper wedding ring from the jeweler in Kearney to complement the engagement ring. Flora helped Fiona sew a wedding dress from ivory silk ordered specially from Omaha. Hannah, now nearly 8 months old and beginning to pull herself up on furniture, was fitted for a matching dress. On Christmas Eve, the ranch house was festooned with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. A tall pine tree stood in the corner of the parlor, decorated with paper stars cut by Flora and simple ornaments carved by the ranch hands. A fire blazed in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the assembled guests. Judge Thompson from Kearney had agreed to perform the ceremony. He stood before the hearth, Thomas beside him looking handsome in a new black suit. The ranch hands were cleaned up and uncomfortable in their Sunday best, and Mrs. Parker dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Flora entered first, holding Hannah, who was wide-eyed at all the attention and clutching a tiny posy of winter berries. Then Fiona appeared in the doorway, radiant in her ivory gown, her auburn hair arranged in soft curls beneath a simple veil. Thomas's face as he watched her approach was a study in wonder and love. When she reached his side and placed her hand in his, he whispered, "You're the most beautiful sight I've ever seen." The ceremony was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged vows and rings, promising to love and cherish each other for all their days. When Judge Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas drew Fiona into a tender kiss that brought cheers from the assembled company. "Mrs. Irwin," he murmured against her lips. "Mr. Irwin," she replied with a smile that lit her entire face. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music provided by Charlie on his fiddle and Mac on harmonica. Everyone danced, even Flora, who was coaxed onto the floor by Jenkins. Hannah was passed from admiring arms to admiring arms, soaking up the attention, and adding her own happy babbles to the general merriment. As the evening wore on, Thomas and Fiona managed to slip away for a moment alone on the porch. The winter night was clear, stars brilliant in the dark sky and their breath frosted in the cold air. "Happy?" Thomas asked, wrapping his arms around her. "More than I ever thought possible," Fiona replied, leaning back against his chest. "If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be here now, a bride again and so completely in love, I would never have believed them." "Life has a way of surprising us," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "When I rode into town that day, I had no idea I was riding toward my future, toward you and Hannah." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, contemplating the journey that had brought them together. Then Fiona turned in his arms to face him. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For everything. For saving us that day. For your kindness and patience. For loving Hannah as your own." She reached up to touch his face. "For giving me back my dignity when I thought it was lost forever." Thomas caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "You never lost your dignity, Fiona." "Not really. It was there all along, in the way you held your head high despite everything, in how fiercely you protected Hannah, in your determination to build a new life." His eyes were intense as they gazed into hers. "I just helped clear the path a little." Fiona rose on tiptoes to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "We should go back inside," she murmured. "Our guests will wonder where we've gone." "Let them wonder," Thomas replied with a smile, drawing her close again. "I'm in no hurry to share my bride with anyone." Eventually, they did return to the celebration, which continued well into the night. When the last guest had departed, and Hannah was sleeping soundly in her cradle in Flora's room, a temporary arrangement for the wedding night, Thomas led Fiona upstairs to the main bedroom that was now theirs to share. As they stood together in the intimate space, lit only by a single lamp, a momentary shyness fell between them. Then Thomas reached for her hand, drawing her gently toward him. "I love you, Fiona Irwin," he said softly. "Today, tomorrow, always." "And I love you," she replied, her heart full to overflowing. "With everything I am." The years that followed were rich with joy and challenge alike. The Triple T prospered under Thomas's continued careful management, expanding to become one of the most successful ranches in the county. Fiona took on a more active role in the business side of things, revealing a sharp mind for figures that complemented Thomas's practical knowledge of cattle and land. Hannah grew into a lively, intelligent child with her mother's auburn hair and a spirit of adventure that kept everyone on their toes. She adored Thomas, following him around the ranch whenever she could and soaking up everything he taught her about horses and cattle. In the fall of 1874, almost 2 years after their wedding, Fiona gave birth to a son they named James Thomas, honoring both her first husband and his father. The boy had Thomas's blue eyes and steady temperament, a perfect complement to his spirited older sister. Flora remained an integral part of their family, a beloved aunt to the children and Fiona's closest friend. She eventually married Jenkins, the foreman, in a quiet ceremony that surprised everyone, except perhaps Thomas and Fiona, who had noticed the growing attachment between them. As the 10th anniversary of their first meeting approached, Thomas suggested a special celebration. "Let's invite the whole county," he proposed one evening as they sat together on the porch, watching Hannah and James playing with their younger brother Michael, born 3 years after James. "To celebrate not just us, but everything we've built together." "It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago," Fiona mused, leaning against his shoulder. "That day in Kearney." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her hair, riding into town that morning. The celebration was held in the height of summer, the ranch decked out in flowers and ribbons. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, and the festivities lasted well into the night. There was music and dancing, feasting and storytelling, children playing games while their parents reminisced about the years gone by. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the land they had nurtured together, Thomas drew Fiona away from the crowd to their favorite spot by Cedar Creek. The fallen log where he had proposed was long gone, replaced by a small bench he had built himself. 10 years, he said, taking her hands in his. 10 beautiful years since I first saw you standing on that auction block, looking so frightened but still so dignified." "And now look at us," Fiona replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears of happiness. 3 children, a thriving ranch surrounded by friends and family who love us. "I'd do it all again in a heartbeat," Thomas said fervently. "Every moment from that first day to this." "So would I," Fiona agreed, "though perhaps we could skip the part where I was sold for a sack of grain." Thomas laughed, drawing her close. "Dearest Fiona, always finding humor even in the darkest memories." "It's easy to laugh about it now," she said, nestling against him. "That darkness led me to you, to this life we've built. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the greatest joys, if we're brave enough to keep moving forward." "You're the bravest person I know," Thomas said seriously. "You always have been." From the direction of the ranch house came the sound of their children's laughter, carried on the evening breeze. Fiona smiled at the sound. "We should get back. Hannah will be organizing some elaborate game that will end with James covered in mud and Michael losing at least one shoe." Thomas chuckled, knowing she was probably right. "In a minute," he said, holding her close for a moment longer. "I just want to remember this, you and me, the sound of our children laughing, the land we love spreading out around us. This is what matters. This is everything." As they walked back toward the celebration hand in hand, Fiona felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. From the depths of despair on that auction block in Kearney to the heights of joy in this life they had created together, it was more than a rescue, more than a romance. It was redemption, renewal, the triumph of dignity and love over desperation and loss. And as Thomas squeezed her hand, as their children ran to meet them with open arms and bright faces, Fiona knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be, not just saved, but cherished, not just surviving, but truly, completely alive.